This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show begins with insight on foreign ownership of U.S. land with K-State Agricultural Economics Department Head Alan Featherstone. Alan breaks down some of the concerns when it comes to foreign ownership of agricultural land, how this information is tracked, and some surprising data for Kansas. Also ahead, with spring upon us, K-State beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff joins us to share some timely reminders for beef cattle. Today, he shares insight on cases of spring lameness, planning with your veterinarian, and facility upkeep. Calves present an opportunity to improve feed efficiency on the dairy. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show by explaining that this is typically accomplished through accelerated gain programs in the milk-fed stage of life. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Alan Featherstone. He is our K-State Department Head of Agricultural Economics, and he's joining us today to discuss foreign ownership of U.S. agricultural assets and even more so our land here in the U.S. So, Alan, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, like I said, foreign land, foreign asset ownership here in the U.S. Why is this topic important? I feel like it's not one we hear commonly discussed when it comes to ag media.
That would be correct. It became a big issue with the purchase of some land in North Dakota near an Air Force base. And all of a sudden, that blew up the topic. Although there has been a history where it has been important. The law in terms of reporting foreign ownership of agricultural land has been on the books probably for 40, 50 years. And there is an annual report produced for Congress that essentially lays out just what that ownership pattern looks like, and certainly being able to track that over time has been very interesting.
Sure, and that kind of tracking in place, there's not a limit on the land purchase. Like you said, it's just kind of a monitoring of that, right?
That is correct, although certainly there are thoughts of certain states or even the federal government maybe limiting that. But at this point, from a federal perspective, it's just monitoring who is holding agricultural land within the U.S.
Sure. And these conversations around foreign land ownership specifically, what kind of fears or concerns come up when we speak about this topic?
There's lots of different things that will come up when we begin to look at that. Some of them are military concerns with regards to just access to land close to military installations. Certainly, there's also some thoughts with regards to competitiveness, with regards to being able to continue to excel in agricultural production, agricultural technology. One of the big acquisitions of agricultural land was the purchase of Smithfield by Chinese investors. There's always a question there with regards to how close they are to the Chinese government, whether or not they're arm's length or not. But in the access of Smithfield, there were several thousand acres that were acquired simply because Smithfield had those agricultural asset ownership. And when Smithfield sold, the land went with it. And all types of things are wrapped up with regards to agricultural land ownership.
Especially, I feel like this is a component of national security that's often thought is that agricultural aspect, because it really could impact national security on that level if our systems here in the U.S. were limited in some capacity.
It certainly is. Along with the acquisition of Smithfield, there's been some concern with the Chinese acquisition of Syngenta. Certainly, a lot of Syngenta seeds are sown and planted in the U.S., and there are all kinds of issues with regards to food security, the ability to modify the seed in ways that could be destructive in terms of whether or not you would put some type of gene in there that would affect yield could have ramifications. Again, you hope that people don't do that, but those are concerns that there are individuals that spend a lot of time thinking about just what's going on from a biowarfare aspect.
What are the major players at hand when it comes to this topic, really?
In terms of from an agricultural land ownership, the top 5 ownership of land in the U.S., Canada is number 1, the Netherlands is number 2, Italy is number 3, the UK is number 4, and then Germany would be number 5. Most of those countries don't raise a lot of concerns with regards to simply the relationship that the U.S. has with those countries and is on pretty friendly terms. The one that you probably hear the most is China. There has been a big increase in land ownership from China. Currently, China is 16th in the ownership of agricultural land, and this was at the end of 2021. They currently hold about 384,000 acres of U.S. agricultural land. Probably the biggest concern is the amount of growth that has occurred since 2010. In 2010, China held 69,000, and so roughly over a 12-year period, it's went from 69 to over 300,000. And again, that's a 455% increase over that period of time, and that certainly has gotten people's attention with regards to just what is going on there, whether or not it's just land ownership from the fact that agricultural land has historically been a good ownership item to increase one's portfolio wealth, or whether or not there are other aspects going on associated with that.
And, you know, when we're thinking about foreign land ownership in the U.S., what states really have the largest amount of land that's been acquired by these foreign countries?
If you look at a map, it's a lot of the southern tier states have more than 500,000 acres owned. There's a lot of ownership of timberland, but probably one of the things that has increased quite a bit more recently is the ownership of cropland, and that encroaches more on the Midwest as opposed to the southern regions.
Absolutely. And we talk more about our neck of the woods here, the Midwest, obviously, and we talk about Kansas specifically. What does foreign land ownership look like in our own state right now?
If we look at this in Kansas, there's 1,100,000 acres owned by foreign entities. You do have to be a little bit careful with that in that the way the statistics are calculated, one of the big things we've seen in Kansas are windmills and also solar farms. The way that they count foreign ownership is if there's a long-term lease on that property more than 10 years. And so with ownership of Kansas land, we're looking at a lot of windmills. A lot of those are on 30 or 40-year leases, and so they would have to be reported. And then also solar farms, a lot of those are 100-year leases, and so those would also have to be viewed as foreign ownership. The windmills, in some respects, the wind is owned. The wind generation is owned by a company with foreign ownership. A lot of that in Kansas is from Canada or Italy. The underlying farm ground is still owned very often by the U.S. landowner, and so they just have a lease for wind rights. And so what's interesting in Kansas is we're probably estimating that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the foreign ownership of those 1 million acres is actually just wind investments. You do have to be careful when you start looking at these numbers and digging into that. And we've recently got access to the information on a parcel-by-parcel basis that does qualify to be reported under the foreign ag land holdings, and so we're kind of trying to disentangle that. But at least first blush, most of the foreign agricultural land ownership in Kansas is wind energy as opposed to the agricultural assets.
Wow, I would have never guessed that large of a percentage would be just for wind assets. That's incredible.
No, it is surprising when you think of it. But again, it does make pause with regards to, okay, what are we saying and what is the true situation? And with so much of it in Kansas being tied to wind or solar, I think people may have a different aspect with regards to concern on the wind assets as opposed to the underlying assets. One of the things they've done with mineral rights, if they're foreign owned, they've separated those out so they don't count. I think the legislation might need to be updated to separate out the wind and the solar, report it separately, and then people can draw their own conclusions of whether or not that's a concern or not. But when you lump it all together, sometimes it can distort the picture a little bit.
Sure, yeah, some important context there to be included in the conversation for sure. And talking about the land maybe that isn't a part of that wind solar conversation here, the purchasing of that other land, has that been recently acquired, or would you say it's been kind of a longer trend?
It's a longer trend. Certainly there's more and more of it increasing over time. In terms of in Kansas, you're looking at about 830,000 acres of cropland. 260,000 acres of pasture, 2,004 of forest, and then 88,000 of other. But a lot of that cropland in pasture is going to be where the wind assets are. So hopefully we'll be able to get some more information here in the next month or so. And we do have some of these maps available on the AgManager.info website. So we will update that with regards to the wind and the solar as we're able to separate that out.
Absolutely. Yeah, maybe an additional conversation we'll have here in the future on this topic as you guys go through that data, which I'm sure is a heavy task in and of itself.
It is. We did have to FOIA the information, and we ended up getting it about a week and a half ago, and so we're just starting to go through it. But one of the things I know people are very curious with regards to Chinese ownership. According to the information, the total Chinese ownership of agricultural land in Kansas is a half acre.
Oh, wow.
And that is in Russell County. And so the Chinese ownership, at least from an informational perspective, is not large in Kansas.
Well, Alan, I know you already mentioned AgManager as a resource where you can kind of see these maps a bit more, but you also spoke in a webinar recently through AgManager as well. Tell us a bit about that.
We had a two-part series looking at agricultural land, cash rents, agricultural land market outlook. Then we also have access to data on a parcel-by-parcel basis within Kansas and then the foreign ownership. And so if you have an interest in those are posted on AgManager.
You can find the link to that in our show notes, which as always can be found on agtoday.net. But Alan, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Department Head of Agricultural Economics, Alan Featherstone, joining us for a conversation on foreign ownership of U.S. land. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff for a conversation on some spring cattle reminders, I think it's fair to say, right, AJ?
Well, spring is upon us, so I think that's fair.
Absolutely. And before we get into things, thanks so much for coming in today. Busy this time of year, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, busy this time of year. It's always a pleasure to come on to be able to talk with producers around the state.
One of the questions you've been getting as of late has to do with some lameness, which, is interesting because it's been quite dry.
We've been in a sustained drought through almost the entire state, and one question that has come up occasionally is, why am I seeing an increased foot rot issue during this drought conditions? And most people think about foot rot. They think about summer grazing. We have very wet scenarios, either during the winter, the spring, where they're wading through mud. Why am I seeing foot rot issues or lameness problems in this drought scenario where they haven't seen a drop of mud in perhaps months?
Right.
And it really comes down to foot rot. Okay, foot rot is a bacterial infection of the foot. However, what initiates that is not necessarily the bacteria. We have to have a breakdown of the skin barrier of the foot, whether that's in a drought scenario, we get really dry, cracked skin in between the two hooves, and we allow that breakdown of the skin barrier allows the natural bacteria that are found in the dirt, found in manure, found in the digestive tract of cattle. So it's a very common bacteria, fusobacterium, that actually causes this foot rot issue. But it has to be initiated by a breakdown in the skin barrier. So during the wet seasons, we think about, sitting in a bathtub too long and your skin gets real, it can get really soft. Well, in a real drought scenario, we get very dry, we get cracking, we get opening of that skin barrier. So we have that on top of what are our cattle grazing on? Maybe we have some pretty dried up pastures where we can have some hard stalks. Maybe those animals are trying to graze into areas they don't normally graze, into thickets, into some brush, where they can actually step on thorns, hard stalks of any type of, hard fibrous forage. Anything that can break down that skin barrier or cause irritation, we can run into that problem.
Sure. So it's not just the opportunity for muddy conditions to introduce this bacteria per se. The opportunity is always there. It's just a matter of what's going on with the hoofs, really.
It really is. And I know a lot of cattle producers that are totally reliant on ponds for a water source. Think about all our cattle that have been having to wade into some of those muddy scenarios that what if there is, getting down to the pond, they have to wade through a little bit of mud to get to the water. Well, Is there gravel? Is there rock? Is there something abrasive in that mud to be able to get to that water source? Sometimes it truly is mud that causes our problems and our breakdown of our skin, even in a drought scenario, just trying to get to those watering areas. So keep in mind that, yes, it's a risk during the wet season, but it's also an increased risk for foot rot and things like that during the dry scenario. We can still get drying, cracking, we can still get some of that skin damage, and that's what ultimately leads to foot rot. However, foot rot, just as a reminder, that is one specific lameness condition, right? Not all lame cattle have foot rot. There's a lot of other scenarios that we can run into problems. And during drought scenarios, when we have hard, almost concrete-like pasture conditions in some situations, we got to keep in mind that sometimes if there is not swelling, usually with foot rot, we have a symmetric swelling starting at, below the just above the heel bulbs, right, on the backside, and then we have symmetric swelling on both sides of that foot going upwards. Now, if we have zero swelling, or the swelling is only on one toe or one side of the foot, we might have something more sinister. We can get stone bruises. We can have, abscesses of the sole. So we have something a little bit more invasive that if you see some of that, either severe lameness with no swelling, or we just have unilateral swelling, just swelling on one side of the foot, call your veterinarian right away, because delayed treatment and some of those deeper infections, they are pretty sinister and they are challenging to get over, but the earlier we implement some of our treatment strategies, the better.
Sure, and those treatment strategies are different for any of those cases, right? It's not a one treatment fits all sort of scenario.
No, so for foot rot, thankfully, we see very good treatment response with injectable antibiotics. Work with your veterinarian. There's a lot of labeled opportunities that we can use in our cattle. Usually they respond within about 3 days. They're almost completely over the issue within 3 days if we catch them early. Now, if there's something more sinister, we have, keep in mind what are the structures of the foot? Well, we have bone, we have tendon, and we have joint space, and then skin. So there's not a whole lot there. If some of those deeper and very important structures under that skin, like bone, like joint, like tendon sheath, if we get an infection in there, it's hard to get out. Mm-hmm. So that might encompass some footwork where we actually have to grind down the sole of the foot to be able to find any type of infection or abscess to relieve some of that pressure. Your vet may use glue-on blocks to be able to provide some relief so they can still be mobile and get around pretty comfortably. Might actually do some localized treatment. So there's, again, it's more invasive. It's not as simple as a foot rot, but the earlier you contact your veterinarian, the better outcome you'll have.
Absolutely. Great reminders there for sure, especially on lameness this time of year. And another thing that I'm sure many are thinking about right now is cattle getting ready to be put out back on pasture potentially. So some of the things that come to mind with that before you put them out, what are some good reminders for this time?
Yeah, so going to grass, hopefully we get more rain. We've had a little bit over northern, north central Kansas, northeast Kansas. Hopefully we get a much wider swath of rain. Let's all be hopeful about that. But going to grass, especially for our spring calving herds, we're finishing up calving. We're preparing these young calves, preparing the cows for the next breeding season. So our traditional going to grass working cattle, it usually happens right before we turn out. Whether you're going to be turning out in May, regardless of what your scenario is, it's an opportunity to implement our management strategies on the herd. Okay, this could be vaccinations, for our cows, making sure we have our pre-breeding vaccines that are included into that management plan, so we can protect that pregnancy even before it happens. Number two, the calves, right? We've got young calves. Usually they're 2 to 4 months of age, depending on when you started the calving. It's our traditional branding time. Now, I know a lot of producers don't brand anymore, but it's the first opportunity we can implement vaccine strategies into that growing immune system of that young calf. It's natural immunity from mom that they picked up from colostrum, starting to actually wane and get quite low at this time. So this is when we can boost that immunity for their own functional immunity before they go to grass. So it's a good primer of the immune system, and then we can boost it later on in life. Along with vaccines, again, work with your veterinarian on what they recommend for your herds because they have a deeper understanding of your own herd. But also things like parasites. internal and external parasites. We might implement some of those. Your bulls, don't forget about your bulls. We still incorporate our vaccine strategies into the bull, make sure that we have internal and external parasite control implemented on those bulls. And also remember that breeding soundness exam. That's a critically important piece right now before the breeding season. I know everybody's been very keen on, yes, we need to get through calving. Maybe you've been to some bull sales, but don't forget the rest of your bull battery at home. Make sure that we have those checked. Make sure that they are fertile and ready to go for the upcoming breeding season.
Absolutely. Yeah, we did a whole segment not too long ago on the importance of breeding soundness exams with Sandy Johnson. Mm-hmm. She gave us some information that surprised me that some producers still to this day, they don't see the value in really doing those exams and how important they can really be.
And that's very true. And nothing can be more detrimental than having an unfertile, sterile bull go out into a pasture with only one bull, and they don't cover anything. And then we have all these open cattle. The way the cattle markets are playing out right now, and those calves this next year are going to be worth a lot of money. So doing our due diligence, making sure that we're giving our cattle the proper nutrition, making sure that they are fertile, ready to go. Now is the time to get efficient within our systems and make sure that, see these things as investments. A breeding soundness exam, yes, it has a cost, but it is also a huge investment into the overall operation.
Absolutely. Yeah. This upcoming season, like you mentioned, the cattle markets, this isn't a year you want to mess up anything along the way. It's a year you want to pay attention to those small details. And one of those small details we actually talked about before is just checking facilities before we even think about getting these cattle run through a chute, right?
That's a great point. So, usually spring working, we're maybe working cattle through a facility we haven't used in a while, right? Maybe we're taking those cattle to a summer grazing opportunity we haven't really been around or haven't really been checking since last fall or last summer. So now is the time before you start working cattle. If you have a working facility and you haven't used it in a little while, check gates, check latches, make sure that there are no broken welds on your chute. Make sure everything is lubed up and ready to go, that, if you do have to grease, any of the fittings on your chute itself, make sure that is ready to go. Gates, making sure that, where your loadouts are, making sure that there's nothing that's going to impede the flow of the cattle. It'll make sure it's safe for both human and animal, and it'll greatly decrease the stress because nothing can rise the stress level more than a non-functional gate, something that should have been repaired last year. We just never got around to it. So take the time, check your facilities now to make sure that they are ready to go for your spring working.
Absolutely. There's nothing worse than having to use like a shoelace or something to hold the gate together when you're desperate the day of. So some great tips to check that out beforehand for sure, AJ. Well, thanks so much for joining us today and for all of these spring cattle reminders, really, I would say. Timely information for sure.
Yeah, spring's it's a fun time. The seasons are changing. The management of our cattle is starting to change. We're implementing some of our key strategies. So there's a lot on the go. There's a lot to be excited about. Hopefully more rains, right? But there's still more to come here for this spring. And it's just good reminders to make sure we're on top of it.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff joining us for a conversation on spring cattle reminders. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Calves present an opportunity for producers to improve feed efficiency on their dairies. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says the best opportunity for achieving higher rates of gains is while the animals are in the milk-fed stage of life.
Today I want to talk with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning feed efficiency on our dairy. There's a lot of information out there on trying to increase feed efficiency on our dairies, and a lot of focus on what we do genetically as well and how that affects feed efficiency. But I think one of the things that we continue to pass by as we think about feed efficiency is where are the opportunities on our farm? And as we look at feed efficiency on our farm, our best converters of nutrients are calves on our dairy. And many of our dairies pass up opportunities to see increased rate of gain on their bottle-fed calves and a way to increase overall feed efficiency on their dairies. So what am I talking about? Well, as you look at the maintenance energy required for young calves, it's actually fairly stable as they start through their growth process. So in the first 60 days of life, a lot of our emphasis is really on maintaining and growing these animals. So early gain during this time comes at a very high feed efficiency and actually a very diminished decrease in cost per gain. And this actually continues then through about the first 120 days of life, stabilizes and then increases once we hit about 230 days of age. So where are our opportunities as we look at increasing feed efficiency on our dairies as we look at our calves? Well, nutrients delivered and trying to achieve higher rates of gain while the animals are in the milk-fed stage of life is really important. So the first 8 weeks of life. So what are the average gains that you get from your heifers being raised on your farm for the first 8 weeks of life? Is it more like 1 pound per head per day? Is it more like 1 3/4 pound per head per day? As we look at increasing daily gain up to the 1 3/4 pound mark, a lot of times we're looking at a very high increase in the total rate of gain during that period. This does come at a little slightly higher feed cost, and that is true. However, as we increase rate of gain during this period, we also decrease the cost per gain as a result. So there is some offsetting benefits to doing this. So number one, we need a healthy calf, and then number two, we need the right feeding program. And in most cases, we'll be talking about accelerated gain programs that are going to include more liquid and a little less dry feed. The liquid is going to cost us a little bit more, that is true, but we're going to recover that as we look at decreases in the cost per pound of gain. We also see significant increases in the overall growth of the animal, not only during the first 60 days of life, but also thereafter, and an increase in first lactation milk yields. So this higher plane of nutrition that we get these animals on to take advantage of their potential for growth early in life continues throughout their life cycle and will put more milk in the bucket for us as they come in to our herd as heifers and then continue into their second and third and hopefully fourth or fifth lactations on our dairy. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to look at the efficiencies in feeding that might be gained by changing some things in our calf feeding programs.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen to Agriculture Today anytime, go to agtoday.net, agtoday.net, where you can listen on demand and find links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher Radio. You can also subscribe on your mobile device using any podcast app. Simply type in the search terms Agriculture Today Kansas, and you'll find this program. Tap the subscribe button, and new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device every weekday. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.